The old manor loomed at the edge of town like a dark omen. No one knew its history, and no one asked. The place had a reputation, though no one could say exactly why. Some said it was haunted. Others whispered about strange rituals held within its walls. The fact that it had become a halfway house was almost ironic, a resting place for the lost and discarded. Aubrey had only just arrived in town, needing the job more than she'd let on in her interview. So, when the hiring manager, a tired woman with a limp handshake and vacant stare, offered her the night shift, she didn't hesitate. A job was a job, after all. Her first day, night, actually, began as any other might, with a brief tour of the premises, keys and codes handed over with little enthusiasm. Aubrey barely listened, too busy focusing on her phone's alarm, hoping it wouldn't run out of charge during her shift. The manager left, giving her a final, almost pitying look before the door closed behind her. The house seemed unnaturally quiet. She could hear the faint tick of an old clock somewhere deep inside, and each tick sounded as if it were trying to keep her awake, keep her aware. Her task was simple: check the halls every hour and ensure all residents remained in their rooms. The director had stressed this last point. Some wander at night, she'd said, but no one is allowed to leave their room after 9. The first hour passed slowly. She counted the rooms, occasionally hearing shuffling and murmurs from behind the doors. The residents, a mix of people trying to get back on their feet, lived with various mental struggles. One resident, a hunched woman named Mrs. Doyle, was known to walk in her sleep, and Aubrey had been warned to gently guide her back to her room if she found her wandering. As the night wore on, Aubrey settled at the front desk, flipping through the dull records and reminders about medication schedules and routines. A creak on the second floor pulled her from her seat. She sighed, grabbing the flashlight and heading up the stairs. At the top, she spotted a figure moving down the hallway. Her heart skipped a beat, but she reminded herself of Mrs. Doyle's sleepwalking. The flashlight's beam illuminated Mrs. Doyle, her wispy hair falling over her face as she stood motionless by a window. Aubrey called out softly, stepping forward. But Mrs. Doyle didn't turn. She just stood, unmoving. As Aubrey got closer, she realized the woman was staring at something outside. "Mrs. Doyle, let's get you back to bed," she said gently, placing a hand on her shoulder. The woman turned her head slightly, but her gaze seemed distant, unfocused. Aubrey felt a chill run down her spine as Mrs. Doyle mumbled something, her words barely audible. Aubrey leaned closer, and the words, though garbled, sent a chill through her. "They're coming tonight. I don't want to go. They want me to go." Aubrey guided Mrs. Doyle back to her room, dismissing the woman's whispers as confused ramblings. She locked the door as instructed, listening to the silence settle around her. She shrugged it off, returning to the desk, hoping the rest of the night would pass quietly. But it didn't. The faint tick of the clock grew louder, its rhythm twisting into something unsettling. She began to hear sounds, not the usual creaks and groans of an old house, but muffled voices, like whispers slipping through the walls. Aubrey shivered, dismissing it as her imagination until she heard another creak, louder this time. It came from the basement. Aubrey hesitated. The manager had not mentioned any duties requiring her to check the basement, but the sound came again. A dragging sound, as if something heavy were being pulled across the floor. She clenched her flashlight and made her way to the basement door, every instinct screaming at her to stay away. The door groaned open, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. The air grew colder as she descended, a damp smell filling her nostrils. Halfway down, she paused, the silence stretching around her. A door slammed shut somewhere above, echoing through the basement. She jumped, nearly dropping her flashlight, her heart pounding wildly. Her breathing became shallow as she continued, flashlight shaking in her hand. At the bottom, she found herself in a narrow hallway lined with unused storage rooms. She had almost turned back when a faint whisper caught her attention. It was a voice, soft and urgent, calling her name. Aubrey. She froze, listening, unable to believe what she was hearing. The voice grew louder, its tone sharper until it seemed to echo through her head. Aubrey. She spun around, shining her light down the hallway, but there was no one. Just the endless, empty corridor stretching before her. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed something strange. One of the storage room doors was slightly ajar, revealing a sliver of darkness beyond. She moved closer, her hand trembling as she reached for the door. Pushing it open, she shone her light inside. Her stomach lurched. In the center of the room was a figure bound to a chair, its head slumped forward, obscured by a tattered hood. She couldn't breathe, her mind racing. This couldn't be real. The figure's head jerked up suddenly, its face hidden in shadow. A rasping breath echoed through the room, filling her with a sickening dread. She wanted to scream, but the sound caught in her throat as the figure began to laugh, soft, hollow, and somehow familiar. The sound was wrong, twisted, as if two voices were layered over one another. The figure's face, twisted and grotesque, began to emerge in the dim light. She recognized it, her own face staring back at her, a look of utter despair etched into its features. Its eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with a terror that seemed to reach into her soul. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, voice barely audible but dripping with malice. "They're waiting for you." Aubrey stumbled back, tripping over her own feet as the figure in the chair began to scream, the sound building, filling the small room. She bolted for the stairs, her mind reeling, the scream following her up the staircase like a twisted lullaby. She reached the main floor, slamming the basement door shut behind her, leaning against it, gasping for breath. The house had gone silent, a suffocating, unnatural silence that pressed down on her. She staggered back to the front desk, desperate to leave, to find some explanation for what she'd seen. But her phone was gone, her keys missing. She fumbled through her bag, the realization sinking in that she was trapped. As the first hint of dawn seeped through the windows, she finally heard a familiar sound, the creak of the front door. The manager entered, her expression unreadable as she looked at Aubrey. "You look terrible," she said with a hint of a smirk. Aubrey tried to speak, to explain, but the words died on her lips. The manager glanced down the hallway, nodding as if satisfied. "Congratulations," she said, her voice dripping with something that felt like pity. "You made it through the first night. Not everyone does." Aubrey tried to respond, but as she looked into the manager's eyes, she saw something that froze her to the bone, a glimpse of her own face, staring back at her, a shadow of terror flickering behind her eyes. The abandoned hospital sat at the edge of town, nearly swallowed by the surrounding woods. Its broken windows and crumbling walls hinted at a dark history, but no one ever talked about it. Locals avoided the place as if even mentioning it would invite something dark into their lives. And for Levi, who had just moved to town and was desperate for work, the warnings had seemed more like superstition than anything serious. The job listing was simple: night watchman needed, temporary. Just 2 weeks, Levi told himself as he drove to the hospital on his first night, hoping the extra cash would be worth a little boredom and quiet. The building loomed as he approached, a silent giant under the pale moonlight. An eerie silence blanketed the place, the kind that hung heavy in the air, as if the shadows themselves were watching him. Levi parked his car, grabbed his flashlight, and headed inside, trying to ignore the feeling that he was being swallowed up by the dark. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dust and mildew. The flickering overhead lights provided only a dim glow, casting elongated shadows across the walls. Levi's only instructions were to walk the halls, check the doors, and report any unusual activity. He figured that unusual activity probably just meant local kids sneaking in to scare each other. The first hour passed uneventfully. Levi wandered the empty corridors, occasionally stopping to listen for sounds in the dark. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. Around midnight, he reached the 4th floor where the maternity ward used to be. He noticed a strange, faint scent in the air, like antiseptic mixed with something sour and metallic. It made his stomach twist. As he walked, he could have sworn he heard the faint sound of crying. Soft, almost like a whisper, it drifted down the hallway. He froze, listening. It was gone. Just his mind playing tricks, he thought, chuckling to himself. But as he continued down the corridor, the sound returned, clearer this time. It was unmistakably the cry of a baby, soft and distant. He shone his flashlight down the hallway, but it revealed only emptiness. Levi's heart pounded as he followed the sound, his pulse quickening with every step. The cries grew louder, almost pleading as he reached the old nursery. The door hung slightly open, and a faint light flickered from within. He didn't remember the light being on before. Taking a deep breath, he pushed the door open, the rusty hinges groaning. Inside, rows of old, rusted cribs lined the walls, each draped in a thin layer of dust. The source of the light was a single, flickering bulb hanging crookedly from the ceiling. It cast an unnatural, sickly glow across the room. Levi shined his flashlight across the cribs, his pulse racing as the cries intensified, echoing off the walls until it was nearly deafening. And then, as suddenly as they had started, the cries stopped. Silence settled over the room, thick and oppressive. Levi shivered, feeling as if he were being watched. He moved to turn around, but his flashlight caught something. A shape huddled in one of the cribs at the far end of the room. His breath hitched. A small bundle, wrapped in a dirty, tattered cloth, lay motionless. Every instinct told him to leave, to turn and run, but something compelled him to step closer. As he reached the crib, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread, a coldness that seemed to seep into his bones. Trembling, he reached out to pull back the cloth. The bundle was empty. A gust of cold air brushed past him, and suddenly he felt something else in the room. He turned around, shining his flashlight into the darkness. But there was nothing, just shadows stretching across the walls, warping and twisting. And then he saw it. A figure stood in the corner, tall and impossibly thin, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes, sunken and empty, stared directly at him. Levi stumbled back, his heart hammering, as the figure began to move toward him, each step slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. "Leave," it whispered, its voice echoing through the room in a guttural hiss. "This place is not for you." Levi turned and bolted from the nursery, not daring to look back. His footsteps echoed through the hallways as he ran, the walls seeming to close in around him. The building felt alive, pulsing, as if it were feeding off his fear. He reached the stairwell, barely pausing to catch his breath before he stumbled down the steps, taking them two at a time. As he reached the ground floor, he heard something else, footsteps echoing behind him, heavy and deliberate, matching his own pace. Panic surged through him, and he sprinted toward the exit, his mind racing with terror. He didn't look back. He couldn't. Bursting through the main doors, Levi staggered outside, gasping for air. The silence of the night enveloped him, a stark contrast to the nightmare he had just escaped. He looked back at the hospital, expecting to see the figure lurking in the doorway, but the building stood silent and still, as if mocking him. Levi didn't return for his next shift. He didn't care about the money. Nothing could drag him back to that place. He tried to tell his supervisor what he'd seen, but they only chuckled, brushing it off as his imagination. "Happens to a lot of people on their first night," they said, patting his shoulder with a knowing smile. He didn't stay in town long after that, but sometimes, late at night, he would hear the faint sound of crying, echoing through his mind, growing louder until it was all he could hear. And in the darkest hours of the night, he'd catch a glimpse of something lurking in the corner of his room, a pale figure with empty, sunken eyes waiting patiently in the shadows. Milo's new job was supposed to be simple: sit in the control room of an old storage facility on the outskirts of town and watch the security cameras through the night. He'd found the listing in an online forum. The pay wasn't amazing, but the ad promised easy work, quiet environment, which sounded perfect for Milo, who'd recently dropped out of college and was barely scraping by. The facility itself was odd, though. Built in the 1960s, it looked abandoned on the outside, covered in creeping vines and graffiti. Inside, it was maze-like, full of dusty corridors and tall metal doors leading to storage units that were rarely, if ever, used. Milo's first day started with a quick tour from the owner, an old man with a nervous energy and a habit of not meeting Milo's eyes. "Just sit in the control room," the owner had said, "and watch the monitors. There are only a few cameras in the facility, so you don't have to do much." He handed Milo a sheet with basic instructions before leaving, but Milo noticed he skipped a whole section, his fingers pressing down on the paper as if to keep Milo from reading it. The old man had paused at the door and added, almost as an afterthought, "If you hear noises, ignore them. Just focus on the cameras. It's nothing to worry about." The control room was a small, windowless box with walls that closed in tightly, lit by a single fluorescent light that buzzed faintly. 6 monitors lined the wall, each showing grainy footage from different parts of the facility. Narrow corridors, empty rooms, and static storage units stacked with old, forgotten belongings. For the first hour, Milo sat quietly, watching the silent screens as boredom set in. At around 2 a.m., something shifted. The monitor showing the north wing, an area with several locked storage units, flickered. The camera's feed wavered, showing static for a moment before focusing again. Milo leaned in, his finger hovering over the keyboard, wondering if he should check it out. But he remembered the owner's words, ignore any noises. Then, just as he relaxed, he saw it. A figure, faint and barely visible, passing through the corridor on the north wing's screen. Milo froze, his pulse racing. The figure moved in a strange, jerking motion, as if it were glitching along with the camera feed. It was tall and shadowy, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. He leaned closer, studying the screen. The figure paused directly in front of the camera, staring straight into it with hollow eyes, its face obscured by static and darkness. Milo's breath caught in his throat. Every instinct told him to get up and leave, but he couldn't look away. He felt a strange, cold compulsion to keep watching, even as his skin prickled with unease. The figure raised one long, spindly hand and pointed as if motioning him forward. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure dissolved into static, the screen returning to its empty corridor. Milo sat back, heart pounding. His first thought was to call the owner, but he stopped himself. What would he say? He didn't want to sound crazy on his first night, especially when the owner had already told him to ignore anything strange. Still, something felt off. He glanced at the instructions the owner had left him, his eye catching the section that had been pressed down, hidden. He lifted the paper, reading it slowly. The words were chilling. If you see someone on the monitors, do not leave the control room. Do not attempt to make contact. Do not let them see you looking. Whatever you do, do. Don't answer the door. Milo shivered, his hand shaking as he put the paper down. The control room was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the monitors. He tried to distract himself, thinking maybe he'd imagined it. But as he watched the cameras, a strange sensation crept over him, a feeling that he wasn't alone. The monitor for the east wing flickered, showing another figure moving in the shadows. This one was smaller, hunched over, its body twisted and contorted. It crawled along the floor, jerking forward in sharp, unnatural movements like a puppet on strings. Milo could barely breathe as he watched it approach a storage unit, pausing to scratch at the metal door, leaving long, dark marks. And then, a knock. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, echoing through the small control room. Someone was at the door, knocking in a slow, rhythmic pattern. Milo's heart stopped. He stared at the door, feeling a chill crawl down his spine. He knew somehow that whatever was on the other side wasn't someone from outside. He could almost feel it, something standing right there, waiting, its presence thick and heavy, like the air had grown colder. The knock continued, growing louder, more insistent, until it was a pounding, rattling the door on its hinges. Milo clenched his fists, eyes darting between the monitors. On the north wing screen, the tall, shadowy figure reappeared, standing in the corridor and staring at him through the screen, its eyes empty and black. The knock stopped, leaving an eerie silence. But Milo's relief was short-lived. The figure on the north wing screen raised its hand and knocked once, slowly, in perfect sync with the knock at his door. Milo tried to stand, but his legs felt like lead. He was paralyzed with fear, staring at the figure on the screen. It tilted its head, and though its face was obscured by static, he could feel it smile, a cold, twisted grin. Then the monitor for the east wing flickered back to life. The twisted, crawling figure appeared, now dragging something behind it. A long black bag that left a dark smear along the floor. It was heading toward the control room. The camera feed crackled, blurring in and out, but Milo could see it moving, jerking closer and closer, until it was right outside his door. He knew he couldn't stay in the control room much longer. In a panic, he grabbed his phone and dialed the owner's number, his hands shaking. It rang and rang, but no one answered. Just as he was about to hang up, he heard a voice on the other end, a whisper, soft and chilling. "Why did you look?" Milo dropped the phone, heart racing, as the knocking resumed, louder than ever, rattling the door. The shadowy figure on the monitor raised its hand and knocked again in sync, its empty eyes watching him through the screen. He couldn't take it any longer. Desperate, he ran to the door, throwing it open, ready to sprint out of the building. But the hallway was empty. He looked back at the monitor. The cameras showed nothing but silent, empty corridors. There were no figures, no bags, no scratches on the doors. Everything was exactly as it had been. Confused and shaken, Milo stumbled outside, breathing in the cold night air. He didn't look back. He got into his car, his mind racing, and drove away, vowing never to return. The next day, he received a message from the owner. "You left without finishing your shift. We need to talk." But Milo ignored it. He never replied. A week later, he saw a new ad for the night shift position. The description was identical, and at the bottom, it included a new line: "Previous night watchman missing. Please only apply if you can complete the shifts." The message sent a chill through him, but he forced himself to look away, hoping he could forget. But sometimes late at night he would hear it, a slow, soft knock on his door, a whisper through the phone line. "Why did you look?"